Have you ever wondered what happens to a man when the woman who once tried to hold him, heal him, and understand his silence stops? When she no longer bends to meet him in the places he refuses to name? When her energy, once warm, once circling, once reaching, retreats into stillness, no longer extending beyond herself? This is where the confession begins. But not with words, with absence. For most men, it is not the woman's presence that reveals them. It is her departure. It is when she stops trying, when she no longer picks up the pieces he keeps breaking, that the mirror of his shadow shatters. And in that silence, something ancient and terrifying surfaces, the child behind the man, the wound beneath the pride. Carl Jung wrote that every man carries within him the anima, the feminine soul image that resides in his unconscious. She is not simply a projection of his desires. She is the compass to his depth, the light to his shadow, the potential for wholeness buried beneath ego. But the anima must be integrated, not possessed, not projected, not idolized or destroyed. When a man meets a woman who touches this archetype within him, not with performance but with presence, something sacred stirs. He sees not just her, but the echo of something eternal, something longed for but unnamed. She becomes not only lover or companion, but a threshold, a gate, a living symbol of his unconscious feminine. But here lies the danger. For the man who is not yet ready to meet himself, she becomes too much, too honest, too still, too powerful. He may say she's too emotional or too deep or too intense, but what he really means is, she sees me. She sees the parts I've buried, the boy I abandoned, the rage I never named, the fragility behind the bravado. And so he pulls away, not because she failed him, but because she saw him. At first, she tries. She reaches into his cozy baldness, misinterpreting distance as depth, hoping if she just says the right thing, stays soft enough, stays quiet enough, he will come forward. She becomes the translator of his moods, the balm for his bruised ego, the nurse for wounds she didn't inflict. She becomes the mother. But the feminine, the true feminine, is not meant to mother men into manhood. She is not meant to bleed herself dry to prove her love. Love is not earned by self-abandonment. And when she realizes this, not intellectually, but in her body, in her soul, something shifts. She stops trying, not out of bitterness, but because she finally understands, if he cannot meet her where she already stands, she must stop kneeling to meet him. That is when the confession begins. Because now, he has no one left to distract him from himself. Her silence becomes a spotlight. Her absence becomes a blade. She is no longer the container for his chaos, no longer the emotional laborer for his avoidance. Now he stands alone, face to face with the very shadow he projected onto her. It's not her he grieves, it's the part of himself that felt whole in her light. Her withdrawal was not revenge, it was restoration. She chose herself, and in doing so, she dismantled the fantasy that she would always stay, that she would always chase, that she would forever orbit a man who refused to become gravity. The shadow confesses in fragments, in sleepless nights where her name echoes in the silence. In fleeting memories of her eyes, not for their beauty, but for the way they saw through him. In the hollow intimacy of other women who do not challenge his ego, who do not mirror his wounds, who do not ask for depth, only attention. But the confession is silent. It doesn't call her, it doesn't apologize, it doesn't say the words she once begged for. Because the ego does not easily surrender, it folds inward, builds armor, blames her for the pain of its own exposure. And yet, deep beneath that defense, the shadow knows. It knows she was real. It knows he was seen. It knows that to lose the one who mirrored the anima is not simply heartbreak. It is the forfeiting of inner wholeness. But the feminine no longer waits for him to awaken. And so, the story continues, not with reunion, but with reckoning. The woman has walked away, not to punish him, but to preserve herself. The man is left to wander the ruins of a connection he never fully honored, a sacred space he desecrated with passivity, and now the silence becomes the teacher he once refused to listen to. This is the stage Carl Jung called the confrontation with the shadow, that psychic territory where everything denied, repressed, or feared surfaces not in neat lessons but in raw, chaotic fragments. Most men are not prepared for this terrain. They were never taught to speak the language of their own emotional underworld. They were praised for strength and punished for vulnerability, taught to dominate, never to feel, conditioned to conquer but never to introspect. And yet, when the feminine energy, especially that of an awakened, individuated woman, departs, it cracks the veneer of masculine control. Suddenly, the man who always had the upper hand becomes unsteady. The roles collapse. The power shifts. For true power was never about control, it was about presence, and she had it. He mimicked it. Now, stripped of her energy, he is left with his own reflection. And it does not flatter him. It demands from him the one thing he avoided while she loved him: accountability. He begins to remember not just moments but patterns, her patience, her invitations to depth, the way she would quietly withdraw after another one of his emotional disappearances, not with malice, but with exhaustion, the countless times she softened her truth to protect his comfort, the way her eyes would dim slightly each time he dismissed her intuition, her insight, her heart. And now he begins to see what he could not see when she was still there. She was never asking for too much. He was simply offering too little. Here, in the loneliness he once chose over intimacy, the archetypes awaken. He is no longer the hero in his mind's narrative. He is not the victim either. He is something in between, the fragmented masculine, the unfinished man, not unworthy of love, but unfamiliar with its demands. He wanted devotion without depth, adoration without reciprocity. He wanted to be seen but not known, loved but not challenged, touched but not transformed. The anima does not allow this. She does not exist to soothe a man's disconnection. She exists to lead him through it, but only if he's willing, and he wasn't. So now she is gone, and the fantasy of endless access, the illusion that she would always be there, waiting, collapses. You see, when the feminine awakens, she no longer fears solitude. She no longer interprets abandonment as a verdict on her worth. She becomes dangerous in her peace, not to others, but to systems that thrived on her depletion. The man who once benefited from her emotional labor now finds himself in exile, not because she exiled him, but because she stopped returning to the place where her spirit was ignored. This is the heartbreak he never anticipated, to be forgot. By the woman who remembered everything about him, to be invisible to the one who once saw even the parts he couldn't name. It is not her rejection that wounds him, it is her indifference. The woman no longer chases, she no longer cries on the bathroom floor hoping he'll text, she no longer rereads their conversations looking for signs, she no longer negotiates her value for proximity. She chooses, calmly, sacredly, definitively. And now the man must do what he avoided when she was still in his life, turn inward. If he is brave, truly brave, he will stop blaming her. He will face the child in himself who never felt enough. He will sit with the emptiness, not as punishment but as passage. He will feel the ache without reaching for distraction. He will meet his ego, not with judgment but with honesty. He may finally see that love was never about being admired. It was about being seen, known, held, not by someone else, but first by himself. The feminine was the mirror. He was not ready, but now, perhaps, he can be. Still, this is no longer her concern. She is not the custodian of his awakening. She is not the answer to his silence. She is not the therapist for his disconnection. She has her own becoming to tend to, a life that expands without needing to be witnessed. If he chooses to evolve, it will not be to win her back. It will be because he's tired of lying to himself. Because even the strongest mask crumbles in the absence of real love, and what's left is either transformation or tragedy. There is a moment, not loud, not cinematic, but quietly revolutionary, when a man sits in the wreckage of what he once took for granted, and he sees it. He sees her not as a role she played in his life, but as a soul, not as a lover lost, but as a mirror shattered. The fragments don't lie. Each sharp reflection shows a piece of himself he handed her to carry. His unspoken fears, his misplaced anger, his hunger for admiration dressed up as affection. And she carried it all. Not because she had to, but because she once believed love meant holding space for his unfinished parts. But space without structure becomes suffocation. You see, the empowered feminine does not withdraw as punishment. She withdraws because her presence has become a performance, because what she gave in full was only ever received in fragments, because holding on to someone who refuses to meet themselves will eventually drag her down with them. And she has chosen ascension. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all parts of the self. For many men, this begins when the woman who once made them feel seen walks away, not in rage, not in chaos, but in clarity. It is the departure that delivers the invitation to the inner world. The masculine must then descend into the archetypal cave, the place where the ego dies and the true self is born, the cave where illusions of control disintegrate and the boy who never felt worthy finally sits still long enough to listen. No more running, no more charming, no more explaining, just silence. And in that silence something sacred happens. The mind quiets, the excuses fall away, and the pain, once avoided, begins to speak. It says, "She didn't leave because you weren't good enough. She left because you refused to become." This is the moment where the man has two paths. One leads back into the cycle, shallow comforts, fleeting connections, ego strokes masquerading as intimacy. The other is the path of the fire, the one he must walk alone, without her gaze to affirm him, without her forgiveness to soothe him, without her softness to save him. He must meet the shadows she once tried to illuminate, and this time without flinching. This is not easy. The ego does not surrender gracefully. It begs, it bargains, it blames. It tells him she was too much, too emotional, too intense. But these are lies. She was never too much. She was simply too aware, and he too afraid. Afraid to be known without performance, afraid to love without control, afraid to be seen beyond his curated self. But love does not bow to fear. It either liberates or it leaves. So now, she is gone. And he must ask himself, will I become the man who can meet the kind of woman I once lost? Not the man who wins her back, but the man who could finally understand her. Because the empowered feminine no longer returns to the version of him that failed to see her. She doesn't double back to remind him of her worth. Her silence is her closure. Her departure is her declaration, not because she hates him, but because she finally loves herself. And when a woman truly begins to love herself, she no longer fears being misunderstood. She no longer needs to be chosen. She chooses. She chooses peace over potential. Stillness over stimulation, a man who is present, not just available, a man who has faced his own fire, not just escaped hers. This is not bitterness, this is evolution. The awakened woman does not ask a man to heal for her, she simply refuses to stay where he won't. She no longer tries to explain her soul to someone who only ever listened with his ego. She no longer waits for his timeline, she honors her own. And he, if he ever evolves, must do so not to impress her, but to finally feel the parts of himself he once demanded she carry, to see himself not through her eyes but through his own. Because the love she once offered was not ordinary, it was sacred, a doorway, a mirror, a chance. And when sacred things are mishandled, they do not scream, they vanish. That is the cruel beauty of her absence. It echoes in every space where he once felt invincible, not as revenge, but as reflection, a whisper of what could have been had he been willing to rise. And so he sits, not in a room filled with noise, but in a stillness that cuts deeper than any argument ever could. For the first time, he is no longer distracted by her attempts to understand him, to fix him, to love him back into wholeness. That soft fortress is gone, and in its place is a silence so pure it becomes a teacher. The woman who stopped trying has not vanished into thin air. She has transcended the narrative. She has stepped out of the archetype of the rescuer and into the sovereign. She is no longer a chapter in his story. She is the author of her own, and while he may still try to find her in the next woman's laughter or in the shape of someone else's forgiveness, what he's really chasing is not her. It is the man he never became while she was there. He is haunted not by her rejection, but by the reflection she offered, a reflection he now must recreate from within. You see, when a woman departs from a place of deep inner work, it marks a threshold. She is no longer leaving to escape, she is leaving to evolve. Her pain has become her alchemy, her heartbreak a rite of passage. She no longer needs his presence to feel worthy, nor his validation to feel seen, because she has seen herself entirely, and once a woman truly sees herself, no one can ever unsee her again. Jung said that we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is what she did. She met her darkness, the people-pleasing, the longing, the desperation to be chosen, and she didn't flinch. She did not numb it. She didn't drink it away, or post it away, or sleep it away. She sat with it, she wept with it, and then she released it. And in that sacred release, she broke the contract she once had with her former self, the self who tolerated emotional crumbs in the name of love, who begged for clarity, who lived on the edge of his maybe. She burned that version to the ground, and from its ashes rose a woman who no longer asks, "Why didn't he choose me?" but who now asks, "Why did I ever wait to choose myself?" And this, more than anything, is what shakes him, because he finally realizes she's not angry anymore, she's not waiting anymore, she's not hoping he changes. Her silence is no longer filled with unsent messages. It is filled with peace. And peace is the scariest thing to lose because it cannot be argued with. It cannot be guilted or seduced or explained away. Peace simply is. Now he must look into the mirror and confront what her absence reveals. Not that she was too intense, but that he lacked depth. Not that she was too emotional, but that he lacked emotional maturity. Not that she left too soon, but that he remained stagnant too long. He must face the boy within, the one who fears rejection so much he hides behind performance, the one who confuses attention with intimacy, the one who thought a woman's love would replace the work he refused to do. But she couldn't complete him, because she was never supposed to. She was supposed to remind him of the work of becoming whole, the work of meeting himself, the work of returning to his own soul, not as a victim, but as a creator. And maybe, just maybe, he begins. He sits longer in silence. He stops reaching for distractions. He begins to journal, to cry, to walk alone. He begins to question the patterns, the ways he withheld love, the ways he demanded softness without offering safety, the ways he expected loyalty without vulnerability. He begins to recognize the way he kept asking women to prove they were worth loving, while never once proving he could hold what they gave. He begins to grieve, not just the woman, but the man he never allowed himself to become. And this grief, finally, is honest. It is not performative. It does not post itself online. It does not seek her back. It just breathes. He is becoming. Not for her, not to win, but because the man he once was can no longer survive in the story he wants to live. And somewhere, not in bitterness, but in quiet liberation, she smiles. Not because he finally sees, but because she no longer needs him to, because now she sees herself. And that vision is more than enough. She has become the mirror he never dared to hold, not because she remained, but because she left without venom, without spectacle, without needing to be understood one last time. Her exit was not a punishment, it was an initiation, one that separated illusion from intimacy, potential from presence, projection from truth. For so long, she had waited in the in-between, the liminal space where women convince themselves that love is proven through endurance, through weathering storms that were never hers to calm, through bleeding patience while he figured himself out, through standing at the gates of his numbness, hoping that if she just stayed long enough, he'd finally see her not as a convenience, but as a compass. But men do not awaken by being carried, they awaken by standing in their own fire, and that's what he was never taught, that real masculinity isn't dominance, it's responsibility. It isn't having control over her emotions, it's learning to regulate his own. It isn't demanding softness from her, it's cultivating safety within himself. So now, in her absence, he is left with the raw truths, the ones that never needed her to speak them aloud, because her departure said more than her presence ever could, that he only offered attention when he sensed her slipping, that he confused emotional labor with love, that he found her power inconvenient unless it served his comfort, and most of all, that he needed her to need him because he hadn't yet learned to need himself. This is the shadow work he avoided, the slow, sobering confrontation with the parts of him he asked her to carry, his shame, his fear of inadequacy, his fear of being truly known. He wore charm like armor, performance like intimacy, but deep down, he was terrified of being chosen, because then he'd have to show up. But now no one is there to decode his silence, to forgive his distance, to soften his cold logic with warm compassion. The space is empty, and in that emptiness, the voice he spent years drowning out finally rises. It tells him, you can no longer hide behind her devotion. And it is not cruel. It is calling him in, because this ache, this reckoning, this grief, is the birthplace of a man. Not the version who is adorned with surface-level confidence, but the one who can sit with truth, who can witness his own shadows, who no longer fears being vulnerable without a woman cushioning the fall. The man who can say, I failed to hold what was sacred, not because I wasn't enough, but because I hadn't met myself yet. This man, if he dares to continue, becomes something rare, not just awakened, but accountable, not just masculine, but deeply human. And what of her? She no longer orbits his transformation. Her journey is no longer centered on being understood by someone who never tried to listen. She has stopped asking why. She has stopped replaying memories like sacred scripture. She does not rewatch the scenes. She does not clutch the almosts. She has no interest in becoming digestible to a man who once choked on her depth. Because she finally understands, the kind of love she deserves does not need to be explained, justified, or proven through suffering. It arrives whole, it arrives rooted, it arrives when both have met themselves in the darkness. Her tenderness remains, but it is no longer up for negotiation. Her love is not absent. It is refined. It is no longer handed over in the hope of being seen. It is offered as a blessing to those who have earned the right to hold it. She no longer desires to be the one who got away. She desires peace, alignment, mutual awakening, and for that she is willing to wait, not in yearning, but in truth, not in desperation, but in deep knowing. And in the echo of that knowing, a new possibility is born, not between them, but within her. The possibility of a life not defined by proving her worth, but by protecting it. The possibility of relationships where she is not asked to explain her depth, but celebrated for it. The possibility of love that meets her as she is, not as she performs. And most of all, the possibility of finally becoming the woman she was always meant to be. Not when he's ready, but because she is. There comes a moment when the empowered feminine no longer seeks closure through conversation, through apology, through one final unraveling of knots he never cared to untie. She learns that not all truths are spoken, some are lived, that the most powerful goodbyes are not dramatic, but dignified. She does not exit the story with flames, she walks out with light, and that light is what haunts him. because long after she is gone, he remembers her laughter echoing through his silences, her eyes searching for the version of him he refused to become, her warmth holding space for his storms. And yet he chose distance, not because she asked too much, but because he offered too little. And the great irony, he didn't lose her when she walked away. He lost her when she still stood in front of him asking to be met, and he remained absent behind his smile. Now, in the echo of her absence, he faces the one question he never dared to ask. What would it take to become the man worthy of the kind of love he once mistook for weakness? It is in this space, between what was and what might have been, that a new archetype begins to form. This is no longer the boy who runs when love becomes demanding, when the mirror gets too clear, when the reflection gets too real. This is the man who sits, who breathes, who listens, not to be forgiven, but to finally understand. He begins to see the patterns, how he sought mothering in romance, attention in place of affection, performance instead of presence. He begins to witness how he used charm to deflect intimacy, humor to mask insecurity, intellect to escape vulnerability. He sees now, she was not asking him to be perfect, she was asking him to be present. But now, that invitation has expired, not in bitterness, but in grace. She no longer waits at the door of his potential. She no longer tries to excavate love from his silence. She no longer performs worthiness to earn fragments of affection. Because when a woman awakens, she does not burn bridges, she plants boundaries. She does not carry men into manhood. She walks into her queendom, alone if she must. And this is where her power multiplies. For she is no longer seduced by half-presence, no longer enticed by the chase, no longer willing to barter her magic for momentary attention. Her gaze sharpens, her standards rise, not from ego, but from truth. She remembers who she is. She is not the ache he calls at midnight, not the emotional labor he mistakes for loyalty, not the open wound he returns to for comfort. She is the temple, and the temple does not bend. It does not chase. It does not beg to be seen. It simply is, and those who are ready must rise to meet it. This is the secret most men discover too late. The woman who once softened herself to be held will one day choose to be held only by those who do not ask her to shrink. And when she does, she becomes untouchable. Not because she is guarded, but because she is rooted, not because she is cold, but because she is no longer willing to burn for those who fear their own fire. She becomes the embodiment of the wild feminine, sacred, sovereign, and whole. And if one day he evolves, if he truly meets himself in the mirror she left behind, he may return, not to win her back, but to thank her for showing him what he could not see, for loving him before he loved himself, for walking away so he could finally arrive. But by then, she is not waiting. She is choosing. And that is the deepest transformation. The woman who once chased love now attracts it through presence. The woman who once feared abandonment now chooses solitude over scarcity. The woman who once begged to be chosen now sits on the throne of her own becoming. Because the feminine does not need to be louder than pain, she only needs to remember her worth. And once she does, there is no returning to the version of herself who tolerated emotional crumbs. She is not lost, she is not broken, she is not his unfinished story. She is whole, and wholeness does not beg. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.